what we would really like to do is be able to account for loss that we have over time and be able to accurately measure that would give us a lot more knowledge when it comes to formulation and being able to account for some of those losses. That would certainly add to the strength in terms of how we formulate products for.
Welcome to the Rumination Podcast presented by Jefo Nutrition. I'm your host, Dr. Greg Eckerle. Today we will be discussing the importance of vitamin stability and premixes and minerals for cattle. With me today to discuss this topic is Dr. Jason Warner, Extension Cow-Calf Specialist at Kansas State University. Dr. Warner grew up assisting with his family's farming and cow-calf operations in Nebraska. Dr. Warner holds his master's degree and doctorate in animal science from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Prior to his employment at Kansas State University, Dr. Warner served as a beef cattle private consultant. In 2022, he joined the Department of Animal Science and Industry at Kansas State University as an assistant professor and extension cow-calf specialist. His objective, along with others, is to support the mission of the land-grant system by serving people through extension and research as part of the K-State Beef Extension team. Welcome to the show, Dr. Warner.
Hello, Greg. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Glad to be here.
Not a problem. And we're looking at spring. So now we're talking about spring green up and looking at vitamins becoming ever crucial as our grass goes from good to great to back and back off as we head to fall senescence. So as we look at that, do we see an increase in interest in vitamin nutrition in cattle over the past years? And if so, what has sparked the resurgence of looking at vitamins again?
Well, you're absolutely right, Greg. And that's the thing is hopefully as we think about this coming up growing season for all producers, we have good plentiful moisture that allows good adequate forage growth and forage quality is key when we really talk about this topic. And so, I think when you come back and you take a look at it, the whole area of vitamin nutrition and how it pertains to cattle, both beef and dairy cattle is really something that I think in past years we really maybe haven't done as quite as much investigative work in that area as where we have some other areas when we think about cattle nutrition. But yes, I think it's certainly an area that we've seen some increased awareness and interest in the part of the industry over the last I would say 4 to 5 years particularly, and I think. When you really take a look at it, that's really primarily due to a couple of different main factors. When we think about the increased interest that's caused, and I would say one of the main factors is that when we think back to 4 to 5 years ago, the livestock industry, animal nutrition industry, experienced a shortage and a supply disruption of vitamins on the market, and as a result, there was a pretty substantial price increase, and that was a relatively short time period in the whole grand scheme of things. But as a result, I think a lot of producers and feed manufacturing companies in general maybe altered or decreased the amount of vitamins that we were supplementing to cattle in an attempt to offset or mitigate those price increases. And so that was kind of a short-term industry event that I think really caused a lot of folks around the industry to take a look at how we're supplementing vitamins to cattle and why that's important, and just to rethink that because of that short-term supply disruption. But also, too, I think that some factors have changed with regards to how we're feeding and managing cattle. And maybe that's become a little bit more prominent or eminent here over the last several years. And so when you kind of look at those things together, I think that there's great opportunity for us as an industry to learn more about this area. But because of that's kind of why we're seeing the increase there.
Right. And as we tick on, and I remember that period of time that market was really volatile. I mean, it hurt a lot of vitamin suppliers and getting into the product for sure. And then but when we've changed how we're dealing that, what implications could we see due to those changes or anything in the cow herd or even in the feedlot animal? Like where would that go by changing these formulas and changing those feeding practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so really it kind of depends on how you're looking at the system, whether you're looking at it from a forage-based cow-calf or stocker perspective, or if you're looking at it more from a growing and finishing animal feedlot type of perspective. But when we think about cow-calf production systems and we think about vitamin nutrition, we typically, will associate things like either a delayed or reduced conception rate or pregnancy rates. We'll look at things and think about things like potentially late-term gestation abortions, right up to the time or right when that female is getting ready to deliver a full-term animal, for full-term calf. Weak or lethargic calves, particularly after calving during that first 3 to 4 or 5 weeks of life, retained placenta and fetal membranes and those types of things. And so those are some things that we would typically associate with when we think about cow-calf production systems with vitamin deficiency. And the challenge is a lot of those things are multifaceted, and they can often be compounded with other things. But that's kind of the main things when we think about vitamin deficiencies, and particularly when we think about vitamins in beef cattle production systems, we're usually talking about fat soluble vitamins A, B, and E. But when we think about, we kind of turn the table and we think a little bit about growing and finishing cattle. The most common things we're going to think about there would be reduced average daily gain, dry matter intake, feed conversion, and then oftentimes, I shouldn't say often, but oftentimes we don't often see it, but we oftentimes will associate things like vision challenges or night blindness and those types of disorders or conditions when growing and finishing cattle. Oftentimes we can associate those things with a lack of vitamin intake or a vitamin deficiency in the animal itself. So those are kind of the things that we'll often think about, and those are when we think about making changes and adjustments to how much we're feeding. Those are the things we're primarily looking at and wanting to make sure that we avoid.
Right. No, most definitely. And I know, looking especially on the feeding side, I mean, that thiamine is important for the water soluble, for the stargazing and head pressing that we see sometimes there and things like that. So that brings us to the next question. What challenges does it come when we're formulating, as well as getting to getting the vitamins to the animal? Where can we benefit, or what strategies can we help to make sure we're supplying daily adequate needs?
Well, that's a great question. That's what it all comes back to is understanding, how do we best properly supplement that animal and deliver vitamins back to that animal, with regardless of whatever dietary situation that we're looking at there. A big challenge that I think the industry has is understanding different sources in vitamins and vitamin precursors, and how those can be supplied to the animal, what the availability is, what oxidation levels are like with those. And so when we think about, when you just think about finished feed products that the cattle industry is using, whether it's a finished mineral supplement or a cube or some type of pressed supplement, they may not always necessarily utilize the same source of those vitamin supplements. And so that can certainly contribute to a significant amount of variation in terms of what we can actually get into that animal. But the other part of this too is that we know that there is oxidation or loss, particularly with our fat soluble vitamins and chiefly vitamin A over time. And so the question always comes back to, well, okay, how much are we targeting to supplement into that animal? But then how much in that feed product are we losing prior to the time when that animal is actually consuming that feed? And so are we being deficient in terms of the amount that we're targeting to get into that animal just because of an oxidation or a loss factor there? And so that's a challenge, and that's an area that I think as an industry we need to work on, that our research data that's out there is generally pretty limited. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for as an industry for us to learn and get more information about that, because that'll help increase the accuracy of how we're delivering these products and these key nutrients to these animals at key production times. So the other, and of course at the end of the day, understanding where we are there from a formulation standpoint and correcting for loss is critical, because as we alluded to just a few moments ago, there's a significant cost factor that comes into play, and so that is really critical there as well.
Right. And you mentioned some of these oxidative stressors that we put on the vitamins when we put them into complete feeds or mineral premixes. What type of things are going to be affecting vitamin stability and things like that? What were those antagonists that we mentioned?
And so those things that we primarily think about when we think about vitamins, because we know that oxidation process can happen. We can have basically we can basically have degradation or destroying of those sources over time. Main things that we think about with respect to our fat soluble vitamins, we think about things like sunlight, UV radiation, and we know that those can have negative or deleterious effects on the stability of those sources. Heat is another one. That's a big one, and so that comes into play, especially when we think about things like preserving harvested forages and silages. Oxygen exposure, of course, is a big one there, and then oftentimes just how we're handling feed products. And so when we think about the manufacturing process, and we're taking a feed and we're pelletizing it, or we're putting it into a cubed form, and all of a sudden now we're taking that feed and we're exposing it to friction and increasing temperature on it. And we know that can in and of itself cause some destruction there. And so and then when we think about, this conversation is really geared towards vitamin supplementation, but mineral supplementation goes hand in hand with it too. And a lot of, not all, but a lot of commercial mineral supplements that cattle producers will have access to use will have vitamins formulated into them already with them into a combination product. And there is some evidence that would suggest that the types of minerals that we're mixing those vitamin sources with can ultimately contribute to some oxidation and some loss there as well. So there's a lot of things at play that can contribute to that. And again, that's an area that we don't have a lot of great information on. It really needs to be researched better, but we know that those are factors that certainly at play.
Yeah, most definitely. So storing that summer mineral, be it for the feedlot or your cow-calf operation in the Quonset, probably best to move it away from the wall a little bit, get some good ventilation, keep the temperature and sunlight off of it. So maybe a back corner recessed where it's dry and not as hot, hopefully, and would be a good place to store those minerals.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's that's an area that in general, the industry, we need to do a better job of storing those types of products. And at the same time too, when you think about it, dairies and feedlot operations, where typically, not always, but typically those types of operations, if they're feeding a manufactured supplement that's got vitamins in it, that supplement's going to be fed, generally speaking, in a relatively short time period. Maybe within a few weeks or within a month time period from the time it was manufactured to when it's completely fed and utilized. Conversely, when we get into extensive range management situations and cow-calf and yearling operations where animals are out, and potentially we may be storing feed products for several months, maybe out to 6 months or a year at a time from the time it's manufactured till when the time that it's fed. And then also too, when you think about those segments of the industry, the cow-calf stocker backgrounding segments of the industry, they typically will source a lot of their feed products through a dealer or distribution type of a network where feed is manufactured, of course, by a regional mill or manufacturer, and it goes through a distribution chain. And so because of that, it has a longer time period from the time period when it's made to when it's delivered to the producer and ultimately fed. So there's a much longer time period in there, and more opportunities for that feed to be handled and many different situations managed differently, and as a result, potentially exposed to some differences in storage that can impact how those vitamins are being stored and preserved.
Right. Yeah, most definitely. And so when we think about that, and so formulating products, are we generally still going to over formulate to account for some of that loss instead of being right on the nose, or are we lowering that due to, say, cost objections that we're seeing, or how are we typically formulating those products today to account for some of this loss that we know that's taking place?
That's a good question. And I think what we would really like to do is be able to account for loss that we have over time and be able to accurately measure that would give us a lot more knowledge when it comes to formulation and being able to account for some of those losses. That would certainly add to the strength in terms of how we formulate products for. Historically, when you think about it, when you look back at what the industry has done, typically most of those products are going to be formulated to supply somewhere between 50 and 100% of the animal's total recommended needs in a particular product. and a lot of them will be closer to 100% when we think about vitamins. But I think that is an area where if we had better knowledge in terms of what our loss would be, there is some information out there that would suggest, for some sources of vitamin A, it might be 1 to maybe 10%, per month of the total source that's lost there. But that is going to vary tremendously, and I think that there's some limited data out there, and that's again an area that I think the industry could benefit from increased research on that. But typically, right around 100% of the animal's needs is what we're going to formulate into that supply, and that's different. It's a little different conversation if you're looking at formulating a product that's going to be fed right away versus a product that's going to be fed and stored for a longer time period, and particularly if it's a custom label product or a product that is going to be manufactured and sold in a retail format where all of a sudden now that you've got to think about labeling requirements on that from a manufacturing standpoint versus a custom product where you have more variation there and you're maybe not necessarily quite as restricted from a labeling standpoint. That certainly enters into the conversation too, right?
Right. Yeah, I know. Definitely. I think with labeling requirements, they have to be within 5 or 3% of the label based on whatever state you're in. And so those manufactured products definitely hold a tighter grip on it. So having that knowledge of degradation or providing some form of protection on those vitamins would be crucial for those industry partners that we have to make the product last a little bit longer on the shelf from any degradations. So we talk about vitamin availability, vitamins being crucial in the diet. Where do we see water and other forage components like lignin, hemicellulose, cellulose, and things like that may get in there and affect nutrition as a whole when it comes to vitamin nutrition?
That's a good question. I think water potentially could be something that when we think about water quality, that can potentially impact what we can see from a vitamin digestibility and utilization standpoint. Particularly, I think about one of the most common challenges that we see with water quality is sulfates or high sulfur content in drinking water for livestock. And so when we think about potentially on the vitamin side, one of the first that comes to mind would be thiamine, and we know that can often be associated in conjunction with high dietary sulfur. And so if we have deficient thiamine intake in the animal or thiamine availability, high levels of dietary sulfur contributed from the water in this case, and of course that can obviously greatly depend on what the dietary source is. When we think about just water consumption, that can be an area where potentially water can have a negative impact there. The quality in and of itself can have a negative impact there on what we can see from a vitamin utilization standpoint. So that's an area where those two can interact. And yeah, I think that's something that we often don't pay as much attention to as probably what we should in certain areas.
Right. And then I know there's been some recent work out there with choline looking at bringing in a little bit more water into the cell as it's a betaine precursor, and then it increases colostrum quality and quantity. And so, that's kind of important as we look in the spring calving season or even a fall calving operation where keeping animals hydrated, utilizing a supplementation program might be important when we think about that. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, that's a great point. That's a great point. When we think about cow-calf production systems, we know that the cow's status, her status is going to vary significantly depending on what the forage base is and what diet quality is. But we know that just due to the fact that animal, that calf, when it's born, it has very little, if any, inherent storage of vitamins in it. And essentially everything that it's going to need for that first several weeks of life is going to come from colostrum. And so that's a direct function of what the cow's status is in terms of what her ability is to lay colostrum down, and those to lay fat soluble vitamins down and A down, particularly in colostrum. So that's really critical, and that's an area that we really need to make sure that we're focusing on is that late gestation time period, because we know that that's critical for what we can potentially have in colostrum. And of course that applies all across the board, but that's really critical when we think about supplementing cows in those situations. So I think that's an area that again, we really need to focus more on.
Right. And so as we're kind of trying to look at tying all this together, so we have interactions from antagonists coming from the feed processing themselves, be it friction, heat, other components of the diet coming in, the metals or whatever are in the component of the feed. Then we have nutritional things that we can't get rid of in the forages, lignin, water quality, sulfates, probably molybdenum probably does something with vitamins. Is there a benefit, in your opinion, to protecting some of these vitamins, putting them in a matrix or some form of protected form to kind of guard them through these productive processes, to make sure that what we formulate for, what we're paying for, adding it to the product is getting delivered appropriately to the animal?
Well, I think that is an area that could certainly be really well utilized and would have a tremendous amount of benefit just for the industry in general. One thing that I think about is can we lower the overall amount that we need to supplement in a diet and therefore reduce costs by having some sort of protective mechanism or technology there in place to be able to hinder or decrease the amount of oxidation and loss that we have. So if it enables us to essentially be able to provide less to the animal because more of it's going to be available to that animal later on when it's actually consumed and needed. Yes, I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for technology like that, and that's a great fit there. I think the other part of it too is thinking about does that enable us to maybe target some of these vitamins and these levels at key times and maybe be a little bit more strategic about the timing and the rate in which we're supplementing vitamins to those animals and being a little bit more deliberate in our approach there, and maybe knowing, okay, if we use a product or if there is that technology out there that allows us to increase absorption and increase availability of the animal later on when it's critically needed, does that allow us to, during times when the requirement for that animal is very low during second trimester and once lactation is ceased, is that a time period where we can potentially supplement less to that animal and still maintain an adequate status of that animal, and yet come back later on when requirements are higher during late gestation, early lactation, and provide a more strategic targeted supplementation rate to that animal. So I think that's an area that would certainly have a tremendous amount of benefit, and strictly just having a better handle on what we think our requirements are. The data, generally speaking, when it comes to requirements on a per head per day basis are fairly limited, and there's some indication that would say for cows and for heifers as well. Practically speaking, maybe we need to feed twice as much as what the NRC would say. And the question becomes, okay, well, maybe it doesn't need to be quite that much. Maybe it is higher than that, but if we're using a product that has more of a targeted a protective mechanism on that, maybe again that allows us to decrease the amount that we're feeding there, and again that all comes back to cost. Because if you take a base product and you double your fortification rate in that product, that can certainly add a significant amount of cost to an animal, maybe 10 to 15 cents per head per day, or higher than that, which for some folks can add up certainly very quickly. So that's a great area that I think we could benefit from, certainly.
Yeah, definitely. And it cost and what we're seeing with the markets right now, I mean, it comes down to every penny that we're getting out of these herds. And even in the feedlot industry, I mean, margins erode every day, or we can be on the winner side of the market. So being mindful of technologies that can provide targeted nutrition is going to be important as we move forward, for sure, to help make everything work together in a holistic system. It's the way I'm going to describe it kind of is protect it and get it to the animal where it needs to be and maximize our profit for the right return, right?
Absolutely. I think that's a great way to look at it, Greg. And the thing we have to keep in mind too is that generally speaking, I think our production systems are changing. Certainly on the dairy side of things, we rely at much greater extent on harvested forages and feeds. But even on the cow-calf side of things, I think we're seeing some changes in how we're feeding and supplementing cattle there. We're using a lot more byproducts than what the industry did 10 to 15 years ago. I think the silage utilization in cow-calf production systems around the Midwest has probably grown. We've taken a lot of alfalfa hay out of production and some of these other higher quality forages that traditionally have provided a lot of vitamin A sources through the beta carotene content that they have. But, and then when you think about drought stress situations and things like that, just a lot of things at play that are all contributing to this conversation, certainly. So
yeah, most definitely. Well, Dr. Warner, I'd like to thank you for being with us here today. And then if you have any final thoughts, I'd welcome you to share those.
Dr. Eckerle, certainly appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you and have this conversation. I think it's a great area of discussion, and look forward to visiting with you down the road on it. And appreciate the opportunity. This is a great topic to have out there in front of folks, certainly.
Most definitely. And I think it's timely as we're looking at green up and everything like that and moving into the fall season. If we look a little further out there, vitamins are going to play important. So I'd also like to thank our audience for listening to us today. And don't forget to subscribe to Rumination on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or other platforms. Feel free to visit jefo.ca for more information. This podcast was brought to you by Jefo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world. Have a great day.